The storm over Charleston was supposed to be just another southern rain, washing the streets clean of their secrets. But when Silas Carter, a weary veteran, stepped through the doorway of his old bungalow with his German Shepherd, Ranger, at his side, he stopped cold. A German Shepherd named Ranger lunged between the fragile twins and the woman who was supposed to protect them. Their pink dresses were torn, their hands were scratched from scrubbing, while the gold bracelet on their stepmother's wrist glinted like a weapon. Behind her polished smile was a plot to break a soldier's spirit and take what was not hers. On the mantelpiece, an old clock ticked steadily, but hidden inside, a silent red light began to record. Each scraping sound, each cruel command, each truth would soon turn this living room from stage to witness. And as Ranger moved, the story would shift from fear to defiance, from cruelty to redemption. What happened next would test the strength of a wounded veteran, the loyalty of his dog, and the fragile hope of two forgotten children. Kao Lintao Thum. Close-up of the army soldier with a surprised look on his face, next to the German shepherd dog rushing from the door towards the elegant but cold 30-year-old stepmother, tall and thin, high cheekbones, long black hair tied back, wearing a yellow silk dress, cursing and pointing at the faces of two dirty-faced twin girls, wearing torn pink dresses, crying, sitting, scrubbing the floor with red-stained hands. Under the heavy skies of Charleston, South Carolina, rain lashed against the narrow streets, spilling down from the iron balconies of old townhouses and running like silver veins along the cracked sidewalks. The city wore its age openly, its oak trees bowing under the weight of Spanish moss, its air tinged with salt and the faint bitterness of the nearby marshes. The storm was neither violent nor timid. It was steady, relentless, a curtain of water that blurred the edges of everything. To Silas Carter trudging up the brick walkway toward his own weary house, it felt like Charleston itself was breathing heavy with him, tired of secrets it had carried too long. Silas was 35, broad-shouldered and tall, his frame shaped by the discipline of military life, but softened by the quiet fatigue of years that followed. His hair, dark but flecked at the temples with gray, clung damp against his forehead beneath the brim of his cap. He moved with the rigid grace of a soldier who hadn't forgotten how to march, but had learned the difference between command and survival. 10 years in uniform had carved lines into his face, not all from sun and grit, but from the things he had seen overseas, things that clung to him in the quiet hours. Since returning home, he had lived like a man half in the present and half in a memory he could not shake. Yet tonight, his boots felt heavier for another reason, a gnawing unease in his chest, a sense that stepping through his front door would not bring him peace. Beside him padded Ranger, a German shepherd, 6 years old, with a sable coat sleekened by rain and eyes the color of amber glass. Ranger had been Silas's partner during his years of service, trained for search and patrol, but somehow always more than duty, a creature with instinct tuned not just to threats, but to hearts. A faint scar ran along his left flank, a remnant of barbed wire from a night mission in Kandahar. Silas remembered how the dog hadn't whimpered then, hadn't faltered, simply waited for bandaging, and then returned to the mission with steady steps. That was Ranger's way: endure, adapt, remain. Now his gait was fluid, his body alert even in the familiar streets of Charleston. Rain rolled off his back, his ears flicked toward every sound, and when Silas paused at the gate of his old bungalow, Ranger paused too, as if sensing what waited beyond the threshold. The house itself had stood since the 1920s, wood weathered into a pale gray that spoke of storms survived and years endured. Its porch sagged slightly on one side, and the paint on the shutters peeled in tired flakes. Yet within its bones lay a stubborn dignity. For Silas, it was a house that held both memories and compromises. He had brought Evelyn Pike here 4 months ago, convincing himself that stability was what his life and his stepdaughters needed. Evelyn was 10 years younger, strikingly beautiful in a way that drew attention wherever she went, tall, willowy, with black hair drawn into perfect symmetry and cheekbones that could cut glass. But beauty had not softened her. She carried herself with a posture honed by ambition, with eyes too sharp to ever be warm. Her laughter in public rang like crystal, In private, her voice was often cold steel. Silas had learned quickly that marrying her had not filled the silence left by Margaret, his first wife who had died of illness, but had replaced it with something more hollow: control. Tonight, Evelyn waited in the living room, dressed in a gown of shimmering gold satin that clung to her like armor. The dress gleamed under the muted light of the brass floor lamp, and on her wrist flashed a bracelet, Margaret's once, now worn like a trophy. Her lips curved into a smile that might have fooled a stranger into mistaking it for kindness. But Silas knew better. She had a way of holding still, poised like a predator studying prey. He hadn't yet stepped fully into the room when he saw what froze him in place. On the soaked rug in the center of the floor, two little girls knelt, their small bodies bent low over the fabric, hands clutching scrubbing brushes too large for them. Their dresses, once pink, were now stained and torn, clinging wet against their ribs. Their hair, golden and tangled, hung in damp strands that clung to pale faces streaked with tears and grit. Clara and Eliza, the twins, were only 7, though hardship had carved something older into their eyes. Their knees pressed into the wet rug, their knuckles red and raw, dotted with tiny cuts from where the bristles bit back. The sound filled the room. Scrape, scrape, scrape. A rhythm of quiet suffering that made Silas's stomach twist. Evelyn stood above them, arms folded, watching as though overseeing a performance. "Not clean enough," she said softly, almost musical. Yet the tone sliced sharper than any barked command Silas had endured in the field. "Again." The girls flinched but did not stop, their brushes moving with the tired determination of children who had learned that resistance brought worse. Silas's chest burned with rage he had not expected to feel so suddenly. But before he could speak, Ranger moved. The German shepherd stepped forward with deliberate calm, his body cutting a line between Evelyn and the girls. He did not bare his teeth nor growl. He simply stood, a presence undeniable, a wall of fur and muscle, his amber eyes steady and unblinking. His tail lifted, ears pricked, a sentinel declaring without words, "Enough." Evelyn's gaze flicked to the dog, and for a moment, annoyance cracked her composure. "Call him off," she said, her voice still low, but carrying an edge. Silas said nothing. He crouched beside the twins instead, his knee pressing into the wet rug. The smell of soap stung his nose, mingled with something metallic that set his teeth on edge. Gently, he wrapped his fingers around Clara's brush, easing it from her hand. She gasped as if expecting punishment, but found none. "It's all right," Silas whispered, voice rough but soft. "You can stop now." He pulled Eliza's brush away too, feeling the small bones of her fingers tremble under his calloused grip. He lifted them both, one in each arm, their wet dresses soaking into his uniform, but their weight was so slight it felt like lifting feathers. Their little hearts beat fast against his chest. For a moment, the memory of Margaret's voice flooded him, the way she used to hum lullabies when the twins had been infants. His throat tightened. Evelyn's smile didn't falter, though her eyes narrowed. "They've been lazy all afternoon," she said, each word laced with a sneer. "The floor needs to sparkle before they rest. A home deserves discipline, Silas. Don't you agree?" Silas turned toward her slowly, his jaw clenched, his voice calm but steady. "The floor can wait." "My daughters cannot." Ranger's ears twitched as if echoing the sentiment, his stance never wavering. The room was silent, but for the ticking of the old pendulum clock on the mantel. Its brass pendulum swayed, steady and impartial, yet behind its carved wooden frame, a small red light glowed faintly, recording, preserving, bearing witness. That device, installed long ago during Silas's final years of service, had been forgotten by Evelyn, but tonight it stirred to life again. It captured every scrape of brush, every cruel command, every moment of the truth that was unfolding. Evelyn's lips thinned into a brittle line. She turned sharply, heels clicking against the hardwood as she strode toward the kitchen. Ranger shifted half a step as she passed, nose brushing the metal bucket nearby. Water splashed across the rug in scattered droplets. Clara let out a sound halfway between a sob and a laugh, burying her face into Silas's shoulder. He held her close, wrapping the other arm around Eliza, and whispered so only they could hear, "You're safe now." The girls clung tighter, and for the first time in weeks, their trembling stilled under his touch. Ranger moved closer, pressing against Silas's leg, his warmth anchoring them all. The storm outside pounded harder, but inside the house, something else had begun. A battle not fought with weapons or orders, but with witness, truth, and the quiet, unyielding loyalty of a soldier's dog. The rain had not let up by the time Silas carried the twins into the small back parlor of the house, a room rarely used since Margaret's passing. The brass lamp in the corner cast a pool of light, warm but narrow, while shadows climbed the faded wallpaper like ghosts unwilling to leave. Clara and Eliza clung to him, their small hands clutching at his shirt until the fabric wrinkled. He set them gently down on the couch, its cushions frayed but soft enough to cradle their thin frames. They sat side by side, knees touching, eyes flicking nervously toward the kitchen doorway where Evelyn's silhouette had vanished. Silas reached for a towel from a basket near the sideboard. Margaret had always insisted towels should be close at hand, for children, for spills, for sudden needs. He knelt before the girls, his hands moving carefully, tenderly, as he wrapped the towel around their scraped fingers. The cuts were shallow but stung fiercely. Each wince made his jaw tighten further. His voice, low and steady, broke the silence. "You did nothing wrong. Do you hear me?" Clara's lips trembled, but she nodded faintly. Eliza, quieter, glanced at her sister before whispering, "She says, we're lazy." Before Silas could answer, Evelyn reappeared at the threshold, her golden dress gleaming even in the dim light, her arms crossed in practiced disdain. Her voice was a blade wrapped in velvet. "This house needs order, Silas. These girls need discipline." Margaret coddled them, and look what it's made them. Weak, her words hung in the air, and for a moment even the storm outside seemed to pause. Silas looked up at her, eyes shadowed with the kind of rage only a soldier who has buried his wife and seen war can hold. But his reply was calm, almost too calm. No child grows strong through fear. Evelyn's gaze flickered, her smile thinning, but she did not argue further. She turned on her heel and disappeared down the hallway, heels clicking against the floorboards like a metronome, counting down to another confrontation. Ranger, who had followed silently, now padded forward. The German shepherd lowered himself beside the couch, his large head resting gently on Clara's thin legs. His amber eyes softened, his ears relaxed, and a sigh escaped him, like an old soldier weary of battles. Clara froze at first, unused to such affection, and then tentatively ran her uninjured fingers through the thick fur. A tiny sound escaped her lips, a giggle, light and brittle, as though it had been locked away for too long. Eliza's eyes widened at her sister's laughter, and for a fleeting second, the storm outside felt less suffocating. Silas leaned back on his heels, watching the moment with a mixture of grief and gratitude. Ranger had always been more than a dog. In Afghanistan, during a night patrol gone wrong, it was Ranger who had found a hidden tripwire before anyone else saw it. He had saved lives that night, and Silas had sworn that as long as he breathed, Ranger would never know abandonment. Now in the stillness of his own home, the shepherd did what Silas himself struggled to do, create a bridge from fear to safety. Later, after the twins had fallen into a tentative sleep, curled together under a quilt, Silas turned to the cluttered shelves near the radio. Dust lay thick on the wooden cabinet, but the radio itself sat solid, a relic from the 1940s, with dials dulled by time. Margaret had adored it, insisting it stay in the house, even when Silas suggested selling it during leaner years. "It holds music the way walls hold memories," she used to say. Silas, restless, reached out to wipe a layer of dust away. His fingers brushed against a corner panel that felt uneven, slightly loose. Frowning, he pressed, and the wooden edge shifted. With a careful tug, the side panel came free, revealing a hollow within. Inside lay a single envelope, yellowed with age but unmistakable in its handwriting. Margaret's script round, confident, certain. His heart jolted as though struck. He sat down heavily, the envelope trembling in his calloused hands. For a long moment, he could not bring himself to open it. Memories rushed back. Margaret laughing as she pinned her hair. Margaret holding the twins when they were newborns. Margaret's hand in his when illness had begun to steal her away. Ranger, sensing the shift, rose and pressed his head against Silas's knee, anchoring him. Finally, with fingers shaking harder than in any firefight, Silas tore the seal. The letter was brief, but every word struck like a bell. If you are reading this, Silas, it means grief has stolen too much from you. Look to the children, Clara and Eliza. Protect them, not only from the world, but from the silence grief builds. Do not let this house become a tomb of sorrow. Fill it with your voice, even if it cracks. Fill it with their laughter, even if it feels distant at first. And when you doubt yourself, remember, love is not weakness. It is the only weapon that endures. Silas pressed the paper to his forehead, eyes burning. For months he had lived like a ghost, numbing himself with routine, avoiding the raw truth in the twins' eyes because it hurt too much to see Margaret there. He had thought survival meant silence, but Margaret's words cut through him. Silence had made Evelyn strong. Silence had made his daughter small. That could not continue. As he folded the letter carefully and tucked it into his breast pocket, footsteps echoed faintly down the hall. Evelyn's voice, sharp with impatience, floated back. "Lights out. Don't coddle them, Silas." He said nothing. Instead, he bent down and kissed each girl's forehead as they slept, his hand resting on Ranger's fur. "Not anymore," he whispered. That night, as the storm quieted into a mist over Charleston, Silas sat awake in the parlor, the letter close to his chest, Ranger stretched at his feet like a sentry. The pendulum clock ticked, its brass notes steady, impartial, but behind its carved wooden face, the hidden device glowed red, quietly recording the first night Silas Carter chose not silence, but resolve. The storm had broken by dawn, leaving Charleston wrapped in a pale mist that softened the sharp edges of the old houses along the narrow lanes. Sunlight tried to push through the heavy clouds, but the air still carried the tang of rain and river water, as though the storm lingered in the bones of the city. Inside the Carter bungalow, the kitchen smelled faintly of coffee and toast, though the mood at the table was anything but warm. The kitchen was small, its cabinets worn to a faded blue, and the table scarred by years of meals, homework, and conversations long since gone quiet. Silas sat across from the twins, his elbows resting on the tabletop, his gaze steady on the girls who sat hunched side by side, as if the weight of the night before still pressed down on them. Clara tried to eat her cereal carefully, the spoon clinking against the bowl, while Eliza's eyes kept flicking nervously to the doorway, as though expecting Evelyn to appear at any moment. Silas studied them both, noting the way Clara's hands still shook despite the bandages, how Eliza's shoulders curled inward, like she wanted to vanish into the chair. He remembered the words Margaret had written in her letter, "Protect the children. Do not let silence bury them." His silence had been a shield for his grief, but to them it had looked like neglect. He leaned forward, voice low, almost conspiratorial, though the only ears nearby belonged to Ranger, sprawled on the floor by the back door. "Tell me the truth," Silas said, his tone quiet but edged with resolve. "Has what I saw last night happened before?" Clara's spoon froze halfway to her mouth. Eliza gripped her sister's wrist as if the question itself were dangerous. For a long moment, the only sound was the ticking of the kitchen clock, its rhythm too fast for Silas's patience. Finally, Clara whispered, so softly he had to lean forward to hear, "Yes, Daddy." "A lot," her lips trembled. "She makes us scrub floors and wash clothes even when we're tired. If we stop, she says she'll tell you we were bad. And if we don't listen, she says, she'll make us sleep outside." The words spilled out like shards of glass, each one cutting deeper into Silas's chest. Eliza buried her face in her hands, whispering, "We didn't want you to be mad at us." Silas's fist clenched on the table, the knuckles white, but his voice, when it came, was steady. "Listen to me. Grown-ups are never allowed to hurt children. Not with hands, not with words, not with fear. You are not bad. You are not lazy. You are my daughters, and I will never let this happen again." The twins' eyes filled with tears, but for once they did not fall. Instead, Clara leaned forward until her forehead rested against Silas's arm, a silent gesture of trust he thought he might never earn again. Eliza followed, slipping her small hand into his. Across the kitchen floor, Ranger lifted his head, tail brushing once against the tile in solemn agreement. Silas exhaled slowly, the decision crystallizing in his mind. He would not fight this battle with anger alone. He needed structure, proof, and allies. Margaret's words guided him, and for the first time in months he felt a plan taking shape. 3 steps, as precise as any mission briefing. Step 1, secure help. He could not be home every hour, not with his shifts and patrols. He thought of B. Collins, the neighbor 2 houses down. B was 58, round-shouldered but spry, her salt and pepper hair always pinned loosely back, spectacles sliding down her nose. She had raised 3 children of her own, buried a husband lost to a factory accident, and carried herself with the kind of unpolished kindness that could make strangers confess their troubles without realizing it. He remembered her bringing over a pie when Margaret was ill, remembered the way she crouched down to speak to the twins at their level instead of peering down with pity. Bea will watch them after school, Silas thought. She won't let them be alone with Evelyn. Step 2, evidence. Silence would no longer protect anyone. He would photograph the bruises, the cuts, the marks left behind. He would document everything with the precision of a soldier logging coordinates. And the clock on the mantel with its hidden device would capture not just images, but voices, the cruelty Evelyn wielded when she thought no one else was listening. Step 3, the law. He knew the system could be slow, knew it could sometimes fail the very people it promised to protect. But he also knew there were those who refused to look away. He thought of Detective Laura Chen, 36, medium height, compact build, black hair and a practical bob. She worked in the Family Protection Unit, and though Silas knew her only by reputation, that reputation was enough. Colleagues said she was patient with victims, relentless with abusers, and carried scars of her own stories of a childhood friend, failed by silence. If anyone would take this seriously, it would be her. Ranger stirred then, as if sensing Silas's resolve. The dog rose to his feet and stretched, paws clicking against the tile as he padded closer to the twins. Silas crouched and gave the command, voice firm. Alert! Ranger tilted his head, ears pricking, waiting. Silas tapped his thigh. When Evelyn comes too close to them, you bark once. Only once. Do you understand? Ranger gave a short, sharp bark that startled Eliza at first, then settled back, sitting tall with a glimmer of pride in his eyes. Clara giggled, covering her mouth quickly as if afraid she wasn't allowed. Silas caught her eye and smiled faintly. It's all right, sweetheart. He's practicing. For the first time in too long, laughter, not fear, bounced against the kitchen walls. Eliza's lips curved upward too, the tiniest smile, fragile but real. The sound struck Silas like a reminder of everything he was fighting for. Later that morning, as Evelyn busied herself upstairs, Silas slipped out to B. Collins' porch. Bea was watering her geraniums, her hands covered in damp soil. She looked up, adjusting her glasses, and her face softened when she saw him. You look like a man carrying too much weight, Silas, she said in her warm drawl. Come sit. He explained carefully, sparing no detail, though his voice faltered when he admitted how long the silence had lasted. Bea's eyes darkened with sorrow but not judgment. She laid a weathered hand on his arm. Grief can blind us, but children should never pay the price for it. I'll watch them. No questions asked. Her words steadied him like a rope pulled taut over a river. When he returned home, the twins were sitting cross-legged on the floor beside Ranger, giggling as they tried to teach him to balance a cracker on his nose. The sight nearly undid Silas, but it also fueled his resolve. He pulled his phone from his pocket, opened the camera, and snapped quiet photos of the bandages, the faint bruises near Clara's elbow, the scratch along Eliza's knee. He saved each image in a locked folder. Then he set the clock on the mantel, tested the recording device with a press of his finger, and watched the small red light glow to life. The house no longer belonged to silence. It belonged to the truth waiting to be spoken. That night, when the twins slept under their quilt and Evelyn prowled the halls with her brittle grace, Silas sat in the parlor with Margaret's letter folded on his lap. Ranger stretched across his feet. His plan was simple, but it was more than survival now. It was war, not of guns and sand, but of voices and paper, of faith and endurance. He whispered to the quiet house, I'll fix this. I swear it. Ranger's tail thumped once in the dark, sealing the vow. Evening draped itself over Charleston in muted lavender, the last of the storm clouds retreating toward the horizon. The Carter bungalow stood quiet from the outside, its windows glowing faintly like the eyes of an old sentinel. But inside, the living room had been staged with deliberate care, every detail polished until it gleamed with a false sense of civility. The lace runner stretched across the walnut table, a porcelain teapot rested on a doily at its center, and brass lamps threw cones of warm light across the worn plaid armchairs. The scene felt too curated, like a stage waiting for actors to step into their roles. Silas sat at the head of the table, his posture composed but alert, a soldier in civilian clothes who had not forgotten how to measure a battlefield. Across from him, Evelyn Pike radiated poise, her golden dress exchanged tonight for a navy sheath that shimmered under the lamplight. Every strand of her black hair was pinned tight, her lipstick painted with surgical precision. Her beauty was the kind that drew stares but offered no warmth, a mask carefully maintained to project elegance while concealing calculation. She had not come alone. Entering with the smell of cologne too sweet and a grin too wide was her younger brother, Trent Pike. Trent was 32, stockier than his sister, with sandy blonde hair slicked back by pomade and a complexion ruddy from long hours at bars rather than honest work. His suit was charcoal gray, shiny at the elbows, his shoes polished to the point of artificiality. He moved with the swagger of a man who mistook charm for persuasion, but his eyes betrayed something restless, a hunger for validation that had never been satisfied. He had once tried his hand at sales, moving from real estate to used cars, failing at both not for lack of opportunity, but for the way his grin always felt a shade too rehearsed. When Evelyn called, he came not for loyalty, but for the scent of leverage. Trent's arrival unsettled Clara and Eliza, who lingered at the corner of the room. Clara clutched the hem of her frayed pink dress, while Eliza squeezed her sister's hand, whispering something only she could hear. Evelyn gestured sharply for them to stay out of the way, her smile never faltering as she poured tea into 3 porcelain cups. "Family dinners are important," she said sweetly, sliding 1 cup toward Silas, 1 toward Trent, and keeping her own untouched. "They remind us where trust should lie." Silas raised his cup politely, but did not drink. Beneath the table, Ranger had settled into a perfect sphinx-like posture, his body long and still, his amber eyes fixed on Trent's every motion. He did not move, did not growl, but his watchfulness was palpable. The shepherd had been trained in the military to guard silently until commanded, and tonight he treated the dining room like a field post. His presence was a weight beneath the lace-draped table, a silent declaration that no deception would go unseen. Trent leaned back in his chair, flashing his wide grin. "Brother," he said, as though the word had always belonged to him, "we know how hard you work. Nights, weekends, the badge never sleeps." Evelyn and I were thinking, why not give yourself some relief? Just temporary, of course. He reached into his leather briefcase and withdrew a neat folder, placing it in the center of the lace runner. The papers within were arranged with practiced hands. "A short-term authorization," he said. "Management of household affairs until you're less buried." Nothing binding, just a signature to make things smoother. Evelyn's voice slipped in, smooth as glass. "It's practical, Silas. You don't need the burden of paperwork and accounts when you're already carrying the city on your shoulders. Let Trent handle some of it. He's capable." Her smile was brilliant, but her eyes measured every twitch of his hand. Silas's jaw tightened, but his face remained neutral. Slowly he reached for the top page, lifting it between his fingers as though giving the suggestion weight. His eyes scanned the lines, not to absorb, but to document. Beneath the table, his thumb pressed discreetly against the carved frame of the pendulum clock on the mantel. The red diode inside flickered to life, its recording device humming silently. This dinner had never been about family, it was evidence. Clara from the corner leaned into her sister and whispered, "Ranger won't let them win." Eliza's eyes flicked to the shepherd beneath the table, and for a moment courage blossomed where fear had lived. Silas skimmed the text, each phrase calculated for coercion. Management authority, temporary custody, Psychological evaluation in case of dispute. The words swam like barbed hooks dressed as favors. Trent's grin widened as he gestured. See? All standard. We just don't want you overwhelmed, brother. His hand brushed his temple, sweat glinting faintly under the lamplight. Ranger shifted slightly then, issuing a low, almost imperceptible chuff, not aggressive, but alert. Evelyn stiffened, her hand tightening around her untouched teacup. The atmosphere in the room thickened, every clink of porcelain suddenly sounding like a gavel. Silas laid the page back on the folder, his voice measured. I'll review these with my financial advisor. Standard practice. Transparency, right? His phone, angled carefully beside the teacup, captured photographs of each page as he turned them. The soft clicks of the camera were masked by the chime of the clock as it struck 7:15, each note ringing like a witness testifying aloud. Trent's grin faltered for half a second before returning. Thinner now. Of course, he said too quickly. We respect transparency. Evelyn poured more tea into her cup. Though she did not drink, her posture rigid behind her smile. The twins clung to each other as the conversation twisted between polite tones and sharp edges. The teapot steamed, lace glowed under the lamp, but the civility was brittle, fragile as glass under pressure. Silas's calm unnerved them more than rage could have. He spoke little, only enough to encourage their pitch, allowing their words to weave the noose they had brought themselves. Finally, Evelyn leaned forward, her smile cool. Silas, think of the girls. This is for stability. You're a soldier. You know the importance of chain of command. Sometimes delegation is survival. Her words struck hard, but Silas met her gaze without flinching. Chain of command means knowing who you can trust, he replied evenly. The silence that followed was broken only by the clock's pendulum, slicing arcs through the air, each swing carrying the weight of truth being recorded. When the dinner ended, Trent gathered his briefcase, his grin strained now, his polished shoes clicking across the floor. Evelyn's hand lingered on the back of his chair a moment too long, her eyes promising this was not the last move. But Silas, calm and silent, knew he had captured what mattered. Words on paper, words spoken aloud, each one preserved in brass and gears, waiting to become more than threats. As the door closed behind them, Clara whispered again, almost a prayer. Ranger didn't let them win. The shepherd blinked slowly, amber eyes steady, his body still a sentinel under the warm lamplight. The clock chimed once more, a single brass note that sounded less like time and more like judgment. The night air along Charleston's narrow streets was thick with river damp, the faint scent of brine drifting from the harbor. Gas lamps flickered along Pinecrest Lane as if uncertain whether to hold the darkness back or let it swallow everything whole. Inside the Carter bungalow, the atmosphere was tense but steady. Silas sat in the armchair by the brass lamp, Margaret's folded letter still pressed close against his chest. Clara and Eliza were asleep together on the couch, their blonde hair tangled like threads of gold. Their bandaged hands curled against each other as if their lives depended on that contact. Ranger lay stretched on the rug before them, his amber eyes open, ears twitching at every sound from outside. The posture of a soldier on sentry duty who knew the night was not yet safe. At exactly 8:30, a firm knock rattled the front door. Ranger shot up instantly, his body stiff, tail straight as a rod, and let out one sharp bark that reverberated through the house like a gavel. Silas rose, his hand instinctively brushing the edge of the mantel where the pendulum clock ticked. The device inside had finished recording hours earlier, sealing the voices of Evelyn and Trent like insects in amber. Now the time had come to hand those truths over. When Silas opened the door, Detective Laura Chen stood there, flanked by 2 uniformed officers and a clerk from the county's night duty staff. Laura was 36, of medium height and compact build, her black hair kept in a no-nonsense bob. She wore a charcoal blazer over a simple blouse, her presence neat but unpretentious. Her brown eyes carried the peculiar warmth of someone who had spent years coaxing frightened children into telling their stories. Yet they could turn sharp as glass when confronting deceit. Her voice, calm and measured, carried authority. "Sergeant Carter," she said formally, though her tone softened when her gaze shifted to the twin sleeping behind him. We have an emergency protective order, signed electronically by the duty judge. This will keep your daughters under secured custody overnight until a temporary restraining order can be filed tomorrow. Silas nodded, his throat tight with a mixture of relief and exhaustion. The clerk, a man in his 40s with thinning hair and spectacles, stepped forward with a folder, stamped and time-coded, the ink still smelling faintly of toner. He read aloud the restrictions. Evelyn Pike and Trent Pike were prohibited from unsupervised contact with Clara and Eliza until further court review. The words settled into the air like heavy stones. Evelyn emerged from the hallway then, her ivory blouse gleaming under the lamp, her lips painted in gloss that no longer shone with confidence. The gold bracelet at her wrist glittered, but the hand it adorned trembled faintly. "This is unnecessary," she said sharply, her voice straining to maintain composure. "Family matters don't belong in police reports." Silas is confused, grieving. He doesn't know what he's doing. Detective Chen did not flinch. She had heard 100 variations of that protest. "Ma'am, tonight is about safety. Arguments will be for the court." She nodded to the officers, who stepped further inside. One retrieved the leather briefcase Trent had left by the chair. Another approached the mantel where the pendulum clock ticked its patient rhythm. Silas pressed the small button on its carved frame, and the faint red diode flickered once. "Audio file complete," he said. "Started at 7:15. Ended when you knocked." The clerk logged it carefully into the chain of custody form, his pen scratching each signature with methodical precision. Detective Chen lifted the top document from the briefcase, her phone camera snapping photographs before sliding the papers into a tamper evidence sleeve. She narrated into her body cam, documenting initial evidence. Management authorization papers presented during custodial dinner includes psychological evaluation clause, photos secured, original sealed. When Evelyn tried again, her voice trembling this time, "You don't understand. I was only—" Chen cut her off gently but firmly. "Ma'am, please remain seated. Anything you wish to clarify will be heard in front of a judge." Ranger, sensing the rising tension, stepped forward, planting himself squarely between Evelyn and the sleeping twins. He did not growl, but his steady stance said everything. "Theo's no," Silas corrected himself in thought. Their daughter's soft breathing filled the silence that followed. For the first time in months, he felt the house itself sigh in relief. By morning, Charleston's mist had lifted into a crisp light, the air carrying the faint musk of wet oak and distant sea. Silas and the twins relocated temporarily to B. Collins' house, 2 doors down. B had prepared the guest room with quilts and a tray of cocoa, her salt and pepper hair tied back as she bustled about with the quiet efficiency of someone who had survived her own storms. Clara and Eliza curled together under her quilt, Ranger lying half on the rug, half nudging against the bed frame, unwilling to let his gaze wander far from them. At the courthouse later that day, Silas stood beside Detective Chen and Assistant District Attorney Grace Ellison, who had taken over the case. Grace was in her early 40s, tall and slim, with auburn curls tied neatly back. She wore a gray skirt suit, the faint creases at her sleeves betraying early mornings and late nights. Grace carried her files not like paper, but like shields, her voice crisp and direct when she briefed Silas. "We're petitioning for a temporary restraining order. It will extend the emergency protection into weeks, maybe months, while family court reviews custody. With the recording and documents, the case is strong. Judges respect precision, and this evidence speaks plainly." The hearing was brisk but solemn. Judge Harper, an older woman with silver hair coiled into a bun, presided with eyes sharp enough to cut through theatrics. When the audio recording played, Evelyn's polished voice twisted into cruelty, her words about discipline and control filling the courtroom with a chill. Trent's false charm collapsed entirely when his suggestion of legal avenues was read aloud. The judge's gavel came down with a single verdict. Full legal custody granted to Silas Carter, effective immediately. Evelyn and Trent would face separate charges of child abuse and attempted fraud. When the order was read, Clara reached for Silas's hand, Eliza's small fingers clinging to her sister's. Ranger, though not permitted inside the courtroom, waited just outside the heavy oak doors. When Silas stepped into the hall, the shepherd pressed against his leg, his amber eyes gleaming with a quiet triumph, as though he too understood the victory. Days later, sunlight streamed through the bungalow's windows, no longer filtered through storm clouds but bright and clean. The house smelled faintly of lemon oil and coffee, but now also of cinnamon from Bee's pie resting on the counter. Clara and Eliza, wearing new pink dresses Bee had mended herself, sat cross-legged on the rug beside Ranger, giggling as they braided ribbons into his thick fur. Silas watched from the doorway, his lips curving into the first true smile he had allowed himself in months. On the mantel above the brass lamp hung two frames: Margaret's letter, carefully preserved under glass, and a new photograph Silas had taken himself, the twins, and Ranger, all caught in the same golden light, their smiles bright, their eyes open. The pendulum clock ticked steadily beside them, but it no longer felt like a sentinel gathering evidence. Its rhythm was the heartbeat of a home restored. Silas knelt beside his daughters, his voice firm but tender. "From now on, this house will only know safety and laughter." Clara and Eliza beamed, their laughter ringing like bells through the old walls. Ranger, sensing the shift, released a long sigh, lowering his head onto the girls' laps, content at last. The shadows of grief and fear had not vanished entirely, but they no longer ruled. In their place stood justice, resilience, and the kind of love that endures storms. For Silas Carter, soldier, father, and husband to memory, the war for his family was over, and in its wake, a home had been reborn. In the end, what began as a night of fear in Charleston became a testimony to love, loyalty, and truth. A soldier who thought his battles were behind him discovered that the greatest fight was not on distant soil, but within his own home. Two little girls who once trembled in silence found safety in their father's arms, and a German shepherd named Ranger proved that loyalty has the power to shield the innocent. Perhaps in your own life, you have seen the same quiet miracles. A neighbor who stepped in at the right moment, a loyal pet who seemed to understand your tears, or the strength to speak the truth even when fear whispered louder. These are the moments when God reminds us that light can always return, even to the darkest house. If this story touched your heart, share your thoughts in the comments. Tell us where you are watching from, and let us know what this story means to you. Your words may bring encouragement to someone else who needs it. And if you believe that no child or animal should ever face fear alone, click like, follow, and subscribe so you never miss another story of faith, courage, and second chances.